So much everyone for being a part of today's conference. My name is Anika Tahsin and I will be chairing today's session. And all together we have three presenters today. And I would first like to start by thanking all three of you. We have MD Rakibul Alam from Bangladesh Army University of Engineering and Technology. We have Professor Debjani Haldar from Chandigarh University. And then we have Pooja Sancheti from Indian Institute of Science Education and Research. And for our room 1 parallel session, our theme is of memories and migration. And without any further ado, I would like to request Mr. Rakib to start presenting. But before that, a few informations that I would like to share, that each presenter will have 10 minutes to present, and we will let you know at least 2 minutes before your time is near its, the ending session. And the Q&A session will be altogether of 10 minutes, and it will be held after all the presenters are done with their presentations. So if I could kindly request Mr. Rakib to start with his presentation.
Thank you very much, ma'am. I hope I'm audible.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you for giving me the opportunity. Myself, Rakibul Alam. I'm a lecturer, Department of English, Bangladesh Army University of Engineering and Technology, BAWET. It is situated in Kadirabad, Nator. So, as the time is very short, I would like to give the glimpses from my paper. And the title of my paper here is The Other Side of the Silence, Dynamics of Memory and Forgetting in Forging National Identity in Bangladesh. So, my paper basically covers the issues of partition and how we remember it, how we construct the memories of partition. In the recorded human history, since the Second World War, the partition of 1947 can be deemed as one of the largest displacements of people. We know that 1 million people died by the resultant violence and some 20 million people were brutally displaced. However, in 1971, Pakistan's East Wing was again separated as Bangladesh. This is a known history. My paper shows that unfortunately, since 1971, Bangladesh has been really struggling in subtle ways to define its national identity. The official or national narrative of Bangladesh rarely acknowledges the role of 1947 partition. It has been overlooked, and hardly there is any serious critical examination of the politics of national identity formation in the light of partition memory. Hence, my paper critically examines the dynamics, politics of the relationship between the official narrative and the collective memory of the partition in Bangladesh. It is primarily interested in not what happened in history, but how we remember it. So it is largely concentrated on different relevant theoretical premises instead of any singular text. To do so, it elaborates on Anderson's proposition of how the construction of collective memory legitimizes the process that creates, sustains, and reproduces an imagined community by providing them with a sense of history, place, and belonging. It also takes into account the notions like selective tradition, we know as forwarded by Raymond Williams in his analysis of culture. So it takes into account the notions like selective tradition and structure of feeling from Raymond Williams' seminal essay, The Analysis of Culture, to illustrate that the shared memory of the past or the rejection of the past provides groups with a kind of sense of community. In this way, history of a period has always been a gradual composition where there is an essential invention of later or different periods of generations. Power relations are always tacitly in play in constructing this sense among citizens. Thus, the politics of memory If we borrow Confino's phrase, the question is actually of who wants whom to remember what and why. Finally, my paper submits that in the absence of official commemoration, memories of the partition projected in fictional works rather create a counter-narrative, as these fictional works have facilitated, altered, or sometimes challenged the collective identity meta-narrative in post-independent Bangladesh. As people's future social and political actions are always guided by the way they envision their past, so my particular aspiration is to give voice to the spiral of silences around the 1947 partition in Bangladesh by delving deep into the dynamics of remembering and forgetting in forging the national identity of Bangladesh. So I'd like to elaborate by quoting Sigmund Freud. Freud, in the interpretation of dreams, writes, by representing a wish as fulfilled, the dream certainly leads us into the future, but this future, which the dreamer accepts as his present, has been shaped in the likeness of the past by the indestructible wish. So in this way, if you keep this comment of Freud in mind, the moment we start digging into the commonsensical layers of linear narratives of history, we start discovering the overlappings, interpretations, and fusions of the past and the present and the future at the same time. And simultaneously, we become aware of the interplays of remembering and forgetting, the endless layers of reconstructions and amnesia. Hence, for any critical understanding of literary and cultural history of post-partition Bangladesh too, we need to understand that it is impossible to overlook our pre-partition past and how the events surrounding the partition have still been impacting our thoughts, actions, and lives even after almost 7 decades of independence. The extent of these effects is so massive and far-reaching that Roy, in his essay for a new thinking on the partition in 1998, writes, the period since 1947 is still too brief to permit a fundamental reassessment of the significance of the event which meant so much to everyone involved. So whenever or wherever we attempt to address partition issues by taking both facts and fiction surrounding them into account, issues like nationalism, religion, power relations, and identity formation, the complex dynamics of the intertraffic between memory, fiction, and dream inevitably enters into our discursive frameworks. Hence, Renan writes in his essay, What is a Nation? Quote, man is neither enslaved by his race, nor by his language, nor by his religion, nor by the direction of mountain ranges. A great aggregation of men, sane of mind, and warm of heart creates moral consciousness called nation. In page number 20 of What is a Nation, Renan writes this excellent, I would say, comment. But if we simplify Renan's take, then it seems that the existence of nation is rather good and even to some extent inevitable, as their existence tends to ensure liberty for the citizens. According to Renan, there always have been 2 essential constituting ingredients of nation building. The first one is past and the second one is present. The past, Renan thinks, quote, the joint possession of rich heritage of memories, while the latter is actual consent, the desire to live together, the will to preserve the undivided inheritance. In short, Renan's submission is that the construction of any nation inherently demands a heritage representing an ancient conquest that is first accepted and then forgotten by the mass of people. My paper gradually unfolds the fissures latent in such generalizations. It warns against the danger of conceiving solely any single version of our past and history. It argues strongly that history making is always a selective study. Raw historical events cannot be transmitted in their original form. Facts have to be transformed into a story first, into a narrative first. Thus, it becomes subject to formal rules of discourse or structure in dominance, as Raymond Williams shows in his analysis of culture. Theoretically, a period is recorded, that's fine. But in practice, this is still a record of a selective tradition. This selective tradition pretends to, and always fails to capture what Raymond Williams calls structure of feeling of any given period, meaning the actual sense of history, or in other words, if we simplify, the collective cultural consciousness. This pretended structure of feeling comes into conflict with or tends to ignore the desire for deviation on alternative and minority trends. Certain magic formulas evolve to postpone conflict or gap between the dominant values and the lived history as such. Such historicization always tends to remain in a particular boundary.
Mr. Rakib, I'm sorry, but I just needed to inform you that you have 2 more minutes until you can conclude. So
okay,
thank you.
ma'am. So I'm skipping certain part and going to the second part of my paper. So holding on to the fact that the never-ending process of reconfiguring and readapting memory is a key, this paper interprets the inherent contradictions in and at times between history and memory. It takes help from Professor Mamun's lecture and Pandey's essay, Remembering Partition, Violence, Nationalism and History. Also, it takes into account Sengupta book, The Partition of Bengal, Fragile Borders and New Identities, and where it is showed that in the absence of official acceptance, or in the absence of official recognition, rather creative works can suggest us counter narratives. It can offer us counter narratives to fill up those gaps, and it can provide a micro-historical and nuanced view of history, alternative view of history. Writers like Syed Waliullah, Syed Samsul Haq, Akhtaruজ্জামান Ilyas, Abu Ishaq, Hassan Azizul Haq, and some others have depicted the various types of identities the masses have adorned as a result of being located at the heart of an ever-changing and shifting matrix of political and social scenario of East Pakistan in the wake of these events. My paper elaborately discusses cases of Lal Shalu, and also it discusses cases of Nuruddiner Shara Jibon, Payer Awaz Pawa Jai, and paper, and also books like that. Akhtaruজ্জামান Ilyas is one of the key figures in this paper. So thank you.
Then move with Ms. Pooja Sancheti from Indian Institute of Science and Education. And in the meantime, we will wait for Dr. Devjani.
Sure. Thank you very much, Anika. Is it okay if I share a PowerPoint as well as I speak?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, it's just, I think with online presentations, it makes sense for the audience to have something visual to hold on to. So absolutely. Yeah, I hope you can see the screen. So I'll start because I know we are short of time. So thank you very much for this opportunity. My paper is titled Migratory Movements in Temima Anam's The Bones of Grace. In transnational literature, Paul J. suggests that the quality of transnational can be understood in 2 ways. The first is the recognition that literature transcends national borders in its circulation and reception. That is, writers and readers from around the globe make a text transnational. This movement, according to him, is specific to 20th and 21st century developments such as globalization, world capitalism, the internet, etc. Keeping these developments in view, the second way is to examine themes that make a text transnational. Migration, displacement, exile, transit, border crossing, cosmopolitanism, etc. are experiences of crossing borders and are legitimized in transnational literature. These multicultural, diasporic, and border literatures are born out of the social politics of post-colonialism and decolonization. The second way is the view that I am retaining as I move forward. Such literature then reflects and embodies the many experiences of migration, displacement, colonialism and imperialism, neo-imperialism, citizenship, and belonging, which impact the entire world. In both cases, the notion of borders as static and non-porous is challenged, but more significantly, the notion of nation is challenged as well. Those that argue for the purity of a nation's culture, or what Carol Phillips has called the tyranny of purity, its pristine and untouched lineage, must contend with the fact that the modern world is comprised of hybridity, movements of people and objects, and the very notion of a nation's being or identity can scarcely be imagined to have sprung in isolation from much larger social, historical, political, cultural, and economic factors. A nation, rather than a nation state, then is always changing and transforming under their influences, as much as each of these forces is changed by the site, i.e. the nation state. This can also be coded as the interaction of the local and the global. Both shape each other and are shaped by the other, and this dialectic can be carried out without sacrificing difference at the altar of a prematurely ecstatic homogeneity. The theme of this conference is the nation, and I explored the albeit narrowly viewed composition of it using Tamima Anam's 2016 novel, The Bones of Grace. The novel is the final in the trilogy that traces, through 3 generations of women of a family, the last half century and the present of Bangladesh. Of the 3, The Bones of Grace most starkly touches upon the qualities of transnational literature I have mentioned, such as migration and displacement, and the effects of these on the composition of the nation in the present, the late 2000s. Of the many ways this novel could be read, I will focus here on the theme of the 4 kinds of movement of people, forced or voluntary, for economic, social, or personal reasons, as well as the movement of objects. Needless to say, the identity of each character in these movements is constantly being reshaped by several simultaneous forces. The first is an urban cosmopolitan elites international movement embodied in the protagonist Zubeda. The adoptive child of a well-to-do couple in Dhaka, she studies paleontology, I'm sorry, I can never get the pronunciation right, at Harvard, goes to Pakistan to dig the fossil of the Ambulocetus natans, returns to Dhaka, travels to Chittagong, and then goes back to the US. In between, by virtue of being married into an even richer family, she travels to Thailand, Dubai, and London on holidays. Her travels are voluntary, and the choice to live or leave are only minimally impacted by external forces, except in one case. Her cultural world is similarly very international. The literature she reads, the music she listens to, and the academic interests she has, and her access to technology are all very urban. Zubeda's character has an inherent homelessness, often contrasted in the novel to her adoptive mother's close ties to the nation, because the latter, Maya, who also features in the other 2 novels, was involved with the war effort and continues to be involved in bringing war criminals to justice in Bangladesh. The ease with which characters like Zubeda cross borders is a direct result of their class privilege. Through the use of the twin trope, the narrative does explore how the nation's twin strands of gut-wrenching poverty and unlimited power and wealth are simultaneously existent, but the worlds are growing increasingly apart. In stark contrast to Zubeda's movements is the story of Anwar, representative of rural poverty and lack of opportunity, who is enticed to go abroad, not to the West for education, but the oil-rich Middle East as a construction laborer. The difference between the rights of citizens and a migratory labor force are most clearly visible in the living conditions of these workers, lack of safety gear and medical access, and no insurance for themselves or their families back home. A minor rebellion of another character named Pahadi, who walked through the air-conditioned mall that these workers have built, rather than use a service entrance, is transgressive enough. Pahadi's dream of a little respect and a little extra money is brought crashing down. Only because Pahadi's death is witnessed by people who matter, blood money is paid to Anwar. The narrative does not clarify if Pahadi's death was informed to his family, if his body was sent back, if his family received any compensation, if the quality of life of the migrant workers changed at all because of this tragedy, or if anyone was held culpable for his death. The third migration is similarly determined by class economics, but restricted within the boundaries of the nation state. Young men from the north migrate to cities like Dhaka and Chittagong, looking for a way to feed their families back home, exemplified by the shipyard workers in Sitakund. As with the international migrant labor force, working and living conditions are dismal, the pay is minimal, and no security or insurance of any sort is available. Prosperity Shipyard, ironically named so, has its own hierarchy between migrant and local workers, as well as among cutters, pullers, etc. The authority figures are not liable for injury or death, and the only positive here, as in the previous case, are kinship circuits that develop amongst the workers. The workers are prone to illness, harm from nature, such as through cyclones and sandstorms, injury due to the nature of the work, oppression and violence in the hands of the higher-ups and the police. They are, for the more powerful, interchangeable sources of cheap labor, dehumanized and entirely disposable. The fourth kind of migration is represented by Elijah and Gabriella, of the white foreigner who comes to Bangladesh either as a tourist or as part of an NGO, somewhat naively believing that what they do might change things, without realizing that the dismal conditions are not local, but globally caused and conditioned. Zubeda rightly chastises Elijah for being blind to the privilege afforded to him by his US passport, and this privilege also blinds him to how Mo, a young orphan boy, is beginning to believe that Elijah can just as easily take him to America. Like Pahadi, Mo also aspires to a better life, only to be killed. It is important to note that aspiration caused these deaths, but not aspiring is just as likely to kill. Gabriela is working with a local NGO to make a documentary film about the shipyard workers. While she begins to realize how futile the project is and how little impact it will have on the lived experiences of her subjects, the interventional gaze is important and forces the local elite, that is Zubeda, to take notice of that which has been rendered invisible. It is also important to note that the narrative power rests with the narrator Zubeda and the camera-wielding Gabriela, and the oppressed migrant workers in this particular novel would have no space for articulation otherwise. Yet, as individual stories are recounted and Anwar's quest takes him to many places, it is evident that these individuals have hopes, dreams, desires, and will. Finally, the last kind of movement is of objects. Textiles manufactured in Zubeda's father's factory are sold in the West. Grace, a cruise liner that traveled all over the world, was manufactured in the US and is being dismembered in Bangladesh, its components being scattered all over the country. Diana, the Ambulocetus natans, the amphibious ancestor of the whale, whose bones travel from Pakistan to the US, is a symbol of a deeper ecological history of the subcontinent, predating human history. The title of the novel references both of these behemoths, the ship and the whale.
Just to inform that you have 2 more minutes.
Sure, I'm almost done. Thank you.
All right, thank you.
Diana and Grace are metaphors of fragmentation and assemblage, and it is tempting to think of the two as complementary halves that bring together 2 points of history and space together. However, this temptation must be resisted, because in doing so, one would assume that history can fit neatly like pieces in a jigsaw puzzle and present a clear, complete, and final picture. Each of the characters as individuals and representatives whether compose the uneven terrain of the nation, accompanied with great variation in their access to the narrative space and to economic and social mobility. Each of the characters is shaped by macro forces like class, religion, and geographic location, but each also to varying degrees impacts these forces. More importantly, through movements, these characters and objects come into each other's paths of circulation, thereby creating the potential for a meaningful encounter with the other, which plays out in complex ways. Hybridity is not just a word, but indicates a continuum rather than rigid boundaries. A social hybridity rather than hierarchy is made possible by these encounters. However, some hybrids are more easily achieved than others in the novel. It is easier for Zubeda to love Elijah and to hope to meet him again, but not for Mo to aspire to a life under Elijah's care in a first world country. The ersatz family that Zubeda tries to create with Shona, her dead twin's daughter, is yet another failed attempt. This is not to suggest that the project is a doomed affair. Rather, as a novel's space stretches to accommodate several very distinct voices and experiences tied to the same nation state, it opens up possibilities of alliances, conversations, and recognition. This can be seen in Zubeda's attachment to Mo and her change in status from madam to appa among the workers. If the nation is an imagined community whose imagination has traction, whose imagination is desirable for the nation and whose is expendable, who decides what kind of imagination is legitimate? A nation may desire homogeneity, one single quality to define itself. Yet, as transnationalism shows, influences from within and without are constantly interrupting this desire and keeping the identity in a flux. It is important to recognize these circulations of people, objects, ideas, and forces as essential to the constitution of any nation. Thank you. I think I'm done.
Thanks,
No, it's okay. It's okay. It's absolutely okay. And thanks for giving me the opportunity to present my paper. Namaskar, greetings from Durgapur in West Bengal. The title of my paper is Reading Bangladesh in Select Culinary Narratives, a Study in Cultural Memory. So I read my paper. The history of Bangladesh is associated with the long history of partition. While Pakistan was born of religious issues between the Hindus and the Muslims in 1947, the birth of Bangladesh in 1971 was a consequence of cultural displacement of the Bengali community in the hands of the neo-colonial Pakistani authorities. My purpose of reading Bangladesh through select culinary narratives is to show that, like Bangla language, Bangladeshi food practices play a crucial role in representing and restoring the cultural identity of the Bengali community in Bangladesh and beyond. The paper looks upon food as cultural site, a phrase I came across in David E. Sutton's book chapter, Synesthesia, Memory, and the Taste of Home. Although Sutton uses it in the context of Greek diaspora, his analysis of food as a tangible site for evoking memories of cultural identity of a group is relevant for interpreting in general all experiences of fragmentation, displacement, and reconstruction of wholeness. Since food is an everyday matter as well as a ritual in social occasions, culinary conventions register themselves as an important part in an individual's cultural memory. Jan Assmann explains cultural memory as, quote, a collective concept for all knowledge that directs behavior and experience in the interactive framework of a society, and one that obtains through generations in repeated societal practice and initiation, unquote. This is taken from Assmann's essay, Collective Memory and Cultural Identity. In an age of globalization, food writing in the form of essay, fiction, and memoir plays a significant role in reconstructing the wholeness of cultural heritage of a community or nation by representing the conventions associated with the cuisines and by preserving the traditional recipes. The culinary narratives from which I have drawn textual references in this paper are significant for representing cuisines as cultural sites of Bangladeshi society through reminiscence based on cultural memory. These texts justify Mary Douglas's view that food categories encode social events. This is from Mary Douglas's essay, Deciphering a Meal. In order to maintain the time limit, I will discuss two texts. One is Kaiser Huck's essay, Alhamdulillah, with Gratitude and Relish. And the other one is Maharuba T. Motushi and Mafruha Mohua's story, Jackfruit and Tamarind. These pieces have been published in 2021 in an anthology titled Desi Delicacies, Food Writing from Muslim South Asia, edited by Claire Chambers. In both the narratives, we find that the narrators look back into the days of either their childhood or the days of their youth. The primary context of Kaiser Huck's essay, Alhamdulillah, with Gratitude and Relish, and Motushi and Mohua's story, Jackfruit and Tamarind, is Chollisha, or the funeral ceremony of the narrator's grandmother, which calls for a community feast after 40 days of mourning. Although both the narratives deal with the representation of socio-Islamic conventions and the rituals of the Muslim community in the ancestral villages of the writers, there is difference. There is difference in their cultural mapping of the rural space. The difference mainly results from the generation gap between the writers. In the cultural memory of Huck, a senior academic and writer, the village space as it has been represented through the reminiscence of his childhood days is a secular reality reified by the friendly coexistence of the Muslims and the Hindus. This is evident in his recollection of the Shraddha, the funeral ceremony of a Hindu neighbor in the village. Although the funeral ceremony of both the communities end with the ritual of eating together, Huck describes that there are marked differences in the cuisines of the two communities. While meat items are quite common in the Chilam dinner, the Sattvic meal of the Shraddha feast not only prohibits meat but also excludes onion and garlic. With the passage of time, the demography of Bangladesh has changed a lot. There is no mention of the presence of the Hindus in the story of Motushi and Mohua, but the narrator represents a secular attitude towards the historical study of Pitha and Khaja particularly in her story. So I will read a little bit from the text, what she has said about the history of Pitha and Khaja. I quote, "Most pithas are made from rice flour, but some, such as khaja, are made with wheat flour. There is a reference to khajas in one of the Jataka stories where Buddha's disciple Sariputta alludes to his partiality for this sweet pitha. In the Jataka story, it is called Pitha Khajaka, but in today's Bengal, the name has been shortened to Khaja. An exquisite variety of ceremonial and festive pithas appeared in the 12th century Sanskrit poem Noishodha Charitru. Later, the 15th century Bengali text Chaitanya Charitamrita and Chondi Mongol would recount one of the earliest cases of the art of pitha making." Unquote. Mohua and Motoshi's story is also remarkable for highlighting the culinary distinctiveness of the local culinary trends, which distinguishes the Muslim food culture of Bangladesh from the Mughal cuisine that dominates the overall culinary culture of Muslim South Asia. In this regard, I would again like to read a little bit from the text, and here I quote, Mughal cuisines include biryanis, pulaus, kebab, kormas, rezalas, and various kinds of parathas. Although these dishes are enjoyed by all, they do not reflect the soul of Bangladeshi cuisine. More often than not, rather than having a rezala, we would have a bhuna, of which there are many variants. In Sylhet, this meat dish is prepared with shatkora, a citrus fruit that is used mainly for its thick but wonderfully scented rind. In Khulna, beef bhuna.
Yes?
Yes?
I just wanted to inform you that you have 2 minutes left.
Okay, thank you so much. I will complete in 2
Thank
minutes.
you.
In Sylhet, this meat dish is prepared with shatkora, a citrus fruit that is used mainly for its thick but wonderfully scented rind. In Khulna, beef bhuna is made with chui jhal, the stem of the long pepper plant. Then there is the famous mezbani beef of Chittagong, which along with the usual spices includes a paste made with poppy seeds, mustard, nuts, and copious amounts of chilies. The dishes of this part of Bangladesh are known to be fiery. In Jamalpur and Mymensingh, pithali is the meat dish of choice for family feasts, unquote. So in these narratives, we find that there is an urge of representing the nation's culinary diversity, and it can be observed in Haq's essay as well, where he describes the grandeur of Dhakai Kachi Biryani, the special dish for the funeral ceremony of his grandmother. The description of the ingredients, cooking method, the aroma, and the taste of this special dish is similar to the Proustian reminiscence of the Madeleine cakes in the novel Remembrance of Things Past. Now I would like to conclude. The narratives discussed above show that the three Bangladeshi writers have used cultural memory as a tool to represent the cultural distinctiveness as well as the cultural diversity of the nation. Their preference for highlighting the regional cuisines represents the urge to preserve the local culture for preserving the cultural identity of the Bangladeshi people. The culinary narratives in this respect can be viewed as archives, which would help scholars and readers to study the cultural history of the nation. Thank you.
All right, what we can do is, as we wait for Dr. Devjani, I think we can start our discussion or any sort of questions that we have regarding the papers. So the audience, can we hear questions from you? Any questions or any comments? Each and every one of these papers were very interesting. And I'm sure you have some observations, some likings, or some queries. So if I could just politely request you to ask your queries or any sort of comments that you have. Alamgir Hussain, if you could just turn on your mic and ask your question.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Pooja Sanjiti, for your lively presentation. I have actually a question regarding the migration that you are talking about in your paper. You mentioned 4 types of migrations that Tahmima Anam presents in her novel, and the migrations are within the country, move out, and move in. So there are several types of migrations that you have already mentioned. My question is, do you think these different types of migrations point to any asymmetrical or unequal power relations governing modern trade practices in the world? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Alamgir Hussain. A very, I think, very pertinent question. And I think in some ways, I've read all 3 of all 3 novels of the trilogy. And I think in some senses, this was the most frustrating read because one wants a little bit more explication of the power differential of hierarchy, of social hierarchies that exist, which the novel does touch upon, but often leaves unanswered. But yes, I completely agree with your question and your comment that the different kinds of migrations do definitely both display and imply the different sort of accesses that people have to resources and to options of travel. So when I say the travel of some of the protagonist, right? She's an elite urban person, has at her disposal money to travel, and has and is not bound, and in some sense, of course, in the hierarchy she is lower than the white national from the US whose passport opens up a lot of doors for them, and she realizes that she doesn't have the same kind of access, and yet her access is much higher than a migrant laborer going to Dubai who's also going abroad, but in a very different set of circumstances and with very different constraints. So the novel definitely lays out layers of power, of hierarchy, of access to resources, with this very sort of with a diverse set of characters who then we can either think of them as individuals or we can think of them as representatives of certain class distinctions. I don't know if that answers your question, but I agree with what you're saying, that the novel does. It's not simply a description of the different kinds of migrations, but definitely also the underlying causes and the effects of these migrations.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for your question.
Are you there?
Yeah, I'm here. Sorry, I got disconnected. I missed moment. This.
Yes, so there is a question for you in the chat box if you would love to answer that.
Okay, let me check. For some reason, it is not shown here.
All right, let me just read it out for
if you got logged out, it will not show. You can't see the previous chat.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let me just read it out for you. So Nirbachita Rodoshi Progga is asking you that what alternatives does the paper suggest to capture the structure of feeling as much as possible?
All right. I think that's a very good question. Actually, there might be many alternatives, but my paper basically focuses on the discourse of post-nationalism. And we know that post-nationalism is one of the recent developments that enables us to conceptualize an alternative framework, as she asked, for reimagining borders and establishing a collective solidarity. And I think that the post-nationalism and its discourse has the potential to reclaim a kind of political space, a third space, which is basically hijacked by the agencies of national entrepreneurs or hyper-nationalism. So I think that by disrupting these meta-narratives of nationalism, if we go forward into the or enter into the post-nationalism carefully, then that could have been one of the solutions to come out of or get over the fetish or the hegemony of nationalism. I would like to actually, it reminds me of Todorov. Todorov has a very interesting insight regarding this. Todorov somewhere wrote that, basically it's in his book, Hope and Memory. He writes, the choice that we have is not between remembering and forgetting, because forgetting cannot be done by an act of will. It cannot be done voluntarily. So what are the choices left for us? So it is not something we can choose to do. The choice is rather between different ways of remembering. So in short, my answer is that if we recapture and reimagine and re-remember with the help of post-national discourses, then I think that could have been one of the solutions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Rakibul Alam. All right, so there is also another question for Mr. Rakibul Alam. So it's from Mr. Nurul Qayyum. How does your paper depict nationalism?
Okay, thank you for the question. Yeah, one of the central issues of my paper undoubtedly is nationalism and related concerns. So basically, my paper views nationalism as one of the binding agent which hold or weld people together. But it is critical about nationalism because nationalism tends to be rigid and creates codified boundaries. It limits the entry. It limits the entry of the foreign, the illegal or extraterritorial elements. And it thinks those elements, or it brands those elements as not suitable for inclusion. So my paper elaborately discusses on those things here. And I also took help from Agamben's seminal work, Homo Sacer, Sovereign Power and Bare Life, where Agamben shows how this type of binding force actually snatches away the constitutional rights of individuals. Not only snatches away the constitutional rights, but also seizes their rights even to live. So nationalism plays a pivotal role in bringing forth this condition. Thank you.
Thank you so much. All right, so I think we will take one last question, and it's directed towards Ms. Shamasri. So Ms. Shamasri, if you could just take a look at the chat box. Ms. Shamasri?
Yes, I'm there.
Yes, if you could just kindly take a look at the chat box, there is a question for you.
Is the culinary segment of a nation represents their heritage as well as can be considered to be a means of migration for cultural practice? Okay, thank you for the question. Due to constraint, I limited my discussion to two texts. In the abstract, I have mentioned about Chitrika Banerjee, right? And it is in her text that we can see how these textual references or how these culinary narratives, they are means of migration for cultural practice as well. Yeah, that's quite true because they not only represent our heritage, but even in the diasporic narratives, particularly, we see that the diasporic people, especially people of the Bangladeshi diaspora, they try to cultivate their cultural practices. They try to restore their cultural identity. They try to protect their cultural identity from being lost in the matrix of multiculturalism through the culinary practices. And this is also well represented in Monica Ali's novel Brick Lane, the references to the culinary practices, of course. Yeah, this is quite present in the narratives of migration as well. Am I able to answer the query? Is it okay? Could I answer the query?
Yes, yes. Tanzina mentions that, yes, you have properly answered her query. All right, so thank you everyone once again for all your brilliant presentations and the brilliant answers for the Q&A session. And with this, I would like to end this parallel session. Thank you so much for giving your precious time during the weekend. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Anika, for being such a wonderful host. Thank you.
Thank you
and
so
a
much.
wonderful chair. Thank you.
Thank you.